Somewhere in a prehistoric forest, a piece of overripe fruit fell from a tree and began to rot on the ground. Wild yeast drifted onto its bruised skin and started to feed, and as it fed, it gave off a strange new substance that had never mattered much to any living thing before: alcohol. The fruit softened, turned sweet, and filled the warm air with a sharp, heady smell that carried a surprising distance through the trees. And something out there, some distant hairy ancestor of ours, caught that scent and followed it. It ate the fermenting brute, felt a warmth it could not possibly have understood, and came back the next day for more. That tiny accidental moment, repeated across millions of years, may have shaped the human story more than any king, any war, or any invention ever did. This is the history of how a mistake made by microbes helped build civilization itself. To understand how deep this goes, you have to go back much further than the first cities, further than the first farms, further than the first human beings. You have to go back roughly 10 million years to a warm forest in Africa, long before anyone walked upright or lit a fire or spoke a word. Our distant ancestors at that time were tree dwellers. They lived on fruit that they picked ripe from the branches, and their world was measured in what the canopy could offer. But something in that world was slowly changing. The climate shifted, the forests thinned, and more of these primates were spending time on the ground where the fallen fruit lay. Fallen fruit is not fresh fruit. Once it drops, wild yeast goes to work almost immediately, and within hours that fruit begins to ferment. It fills with ethanol, the same alcohol found in every beer and every glass of wine today. For most animals, eating a lot of fermented fruit is a problem. The body has to break the alcohol down, and if it cannot do that fast enough, the animal becomes clumsy, disoriented, and vulnerable, which in a world full of predators is often a death sentence. But around this exact moment in deep time, something remarkable happened inside our ancestors. A single small mutation appeared in an enzyme called ADH4, an enzyme that helps the body process alcohol. That one change made the enzyme roughly 40 times more effective at breaking ethanol down. Scientists who study this call it the drunken monkey hypothesis, and the argument behind it is elegant. An animal that could eat fermenting fruit off the forest floor without getting poisoned or falling over had access to a whole food supply its rivals could not safely touch. The smell of alcohol even worked like an advertisement, a scent that traveled through the trees and pointed straight toward ripe, sugar-rich calories. So the ability to handle alcohol was not a vice. It was an advantage. It helped keep our ancestors alive. They did not know the word evolution. They were simply eating what they could reach and surviving. But that ancient enzyme is still inside you right now, doing the same job it did 10 million years ago. And it explains a strange truth. Human beings did not stumble onto alcohol by accident a few thousand years ago. We were built to handle it long before we were human at all. The taste for it was already written into our bodies. All we needed was to figure out how to make more of it on purpose. For a very long time, we did not have to. Alcohol made itself. Wild yeast lives almost everywhere, floating in the air, clinging to fruit skins, resting on grain, and in the mouths of caves. Leave a bowl of crushed grapes in the sun, and it will begin turning into wine on its own. Leave honey diluted with rainwater in a hollow log, and it will slowly become mead. Leave wet, sprouted grain sitting long enough, and it will drift toward beer. Nobody had to invent fermentation. They only had to notice it, and then learn not to throw the result away. The oldest hard evidence we have of people deliberately making an alcoholic drink comes from a place called Jiahu, in what is now central China, dating back roughly 9,000 years. Archaeologists digging there found ancient pottery jars, and when chemists analyzed the faint residues soaked into the clay, they discovered the fingerprints of a fermented drink made from rice, honey, and fruit. 9,000 years ago, before the wheel, before writing, before metal tools were common, people were brewing. They were doing it carefully, storing it in special vessels, and almost certainly treating it as something valuable. And Jiahu was not alone. Across the ancient world, the same discovery seems to have happened again and again, independently, wherever people had sugar and patience. In the mountains of the Caucasus, grapes became some of the earliest wine. In the Middle East, wild grain became some of the earliest beer. On several continents, honey became mead. These early people had no chemistry, no microscopes, no idea that invisible living organisms were responsible for the transformation. To them, fermentation must have looked like magic or like a gift from something divine. A jar of ordinary food would bubble, hiss, warm slightly to the touch, and change into a drink that could lift the spirit and blur the mind. That mystery mattered. Because a substance that seems to come from the gods tends to end up at the center of religion, ritual, and power. And that is exactly where alcohol went. Long before it was a casual pleasure, it was sacred. It was poured out to spirits, shared at funerals, and drunk at the founding of communities. The accident in the forest had become a discovery in the jar, and that discovery was about to help settle the human race in one place for good. Here is where the story takes a genuinely strange turn, one that overturns something most of us were taught in school. For generations, the standard explanation for why humans first became farmers went like this. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers wandering the land, life was hard and hungry, and then one day they figured out that they could plant grain, grow their own food, settle down, and never go hungry again. Bread, in other words, gave birth to civilization. It is a tidy story. It may also be wrong. Because when scientists looked closely at the earliest domesticated grains, they noticed a problem. Those first cultivated cereals were not very good for making bread. They were awkward to grind, low-yielding, and difficult to turn into a decent loaf. But they were excellent for one particular thing. They were excellent for brewing. And this raised a question that still makes some archaeologists uncomfortable. What if our ancestors did not first tame wild grain in order to eat it? What if they tamed it in order to drink it? This is sometimes called the beer before bread theory, and one of the most striking pieces of evidence for it sits on a windswept hilltop in southern Turkey called Gobekli Tepe. It is a site of massive carved stone pillars arranged in great rings, some of them weighing many tons, decorated with animals and strange symbols. And the astonishing part is the age. Gobekli Tepe was built roughly 11,600 years ago, which means it was raised by hunter-gatherers, by people who did not yet farm and did not yet live in cities. Somehow, without agriculture, they organized enough labor to quarry, carve, and lift enormous stones into a monument. How do you convince hundreds of scattered people to come together and do back-breaking work like that? You feed them, and you throw a feast. And at Gobekli Tepe, archaeologists found huge stone basins, some capable of holding many gallons, containing chemical traces that some researchers believe point to fermented grain. In other words, beer. The picture that emerges is haunting. Large groups of people gathering at a sacred site, working together and celebrating with a drink that lowered inhibitions and bound strangers into something like a community. To keep those gatherings going, you would need a reliable supply of grain nearby. And so, the theory goes, people began planting and tending cereals on purpose, not mainly for daily meals, but to guarantee the harvest that kept the feasting alive. If that is true, then one of the most important turning points in all of human history, the moment we stopped wandering and started farming, was driven at least partly by the desire to drink together. We did not settle down only to survive. We settled down in part to gather, to celebrate, and to share something intoxicating. The accident in the forest had become the reason we built the first permanent homes. And once people were rooted in one place, growing surplus grain, the stage was set for the very first cities. Where there were cities, there was beer at their heart. The earliest true civilization we know of rose in the land between two rivers, in ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, more than 5,000 years ago. This was the world of Sumer, a place of mud brick cities, temples that climbed toward the sky, and the first writing ever pressed into clay tablets. And when scholars translated those tablets, they found something telling. A huge amount of the very earliest writing is not poetry or law or prayer. It is accounting. Lists of goods, of rations, of workers, and among the most common items recorded is beer. In Sumer, beer was not a luxury and it was not a vice. It was food, medicine, and money all at once. Workers were often paid in it. A laborer might receive a daily ration measured in jugs of beer, and important people received larger shares. The Sumerians even had a goddess of brewing named Ninkasi, and one of the oldest surviving songs in human history is a hymn to her, a hymn that doubles as a recipe, walking step by step through how the grain is prepared, soaked, baked into loaves, and turned into a drink that makes the heart glad. Think about that. One of the first things human beings chose to write down and preserve forever was, in effect, how to brew. The same pattern appears further west along the Nile in ancient Egypt. There, bread and beer were the twin pillars of the diet, so basic that the phrase for them was almost shorthand for food itself. Egyptian beer was thick, often cloudy, closer to a liquid loaf than to anything you would order today, and it was consumed by everyone, from farm laborers to the royal court. Children drank a mild version of it, priests offered it to the gods, and healers folded it into their remedies, mixing it with herbs and other ingredients to treat everything from stomach trouble to gum disease. Ancient medical writings that survive on brittle scrolls list beer again and again as the base for a cure. It was drink, ritual, and pharmacy in a single jug, and crucially, workers were paid with it. The people who built the Great Pyramids were not the enslaved masses of old legend. They were organized crews of laborers, and records suggest they received daily rations that included a substantial amount of beer, sometimes several jugs a day. It served as wages, as nourishment, and as a reward that kept morale up during brutal, exhausting work. In a world where the local water could easily make you sick, a mildly alcoholic, calorie-rich drink made from boiled and fermented grain was often safer and more nourishing than what came from the river. So the monuments that still astonish us thousands of years later were raised in part by people fueled and paid in beer. The drink did not just sit alongside early civilization, it helped pour the foundations. As civilizations grew richer and prouder, a new drink began to rival beer in status, and it carried a very different reputation: wine. If beer was the everyday fuel of laborers in cities, wine became the drink of gods, philosophers, and empires. Nowhere was this clearer than in ancient Greece. The Greeks worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine, of ecstasy, and of the wild loss of self, and they treated wine as one of the marks of a civilized person. But not just any drinking. The Greeks looked down on those who drank their wine straight and got sloppily drunk. That to them was the behavior of barbarians. Civilized people mixed their wine with water and drank it slowly together with purpose. This gave rise to the symposium, a gathering where men would recline, mix wine in a large shared bowl, and talk late into the night about philosophy, politics, love, and the nature of the world. Some of the ideas that still shape Western thought were first argued over cups of watered wine. In the Greek mind, wine was not only pleasure. Handled correctly, it loosened the tongue, sharpened debate, and opened the door to deeper truth. Handled badly, it exposed a man for the fool he really was. Either way, it revealed character. Then came Rome, and Rome took wine and spread it across the known world. As the Roman legions marched out to conquer Europe, they carried grapevines with them, and everywhere they settled, they planted. Vineyards spread across what is now France, Spain, Germany, and beyond, laying down the roots of wine regions that still produce famous bottles today. To the Romans, wine was a sign of belonging to the empire, a marker that separated the civilized from the savage. A conquered people who learned to grow vines and drink wine was a people being folded into Roman life. Wine was also, quite simply, safer than much of the available water. In crowded towns where water could carry disease, a watered-down cup of wine was often the more sensible choice, and the mild alcohol content helped. Roman soldiers received wine as part of their rations, ordinary citizens drank it daily, and an entire economy grew up around producing, shipping, and selling it across the Mediterranean. By the height of the empire, wine was flowing along Roman roads and sea routes in staggering quantities. The drink had become an instrument of power, binding distant provinces to the center and pouring Roman culture into every corner of the map. For thousands of years, human beings had been limited to what natural fermentation could produce. Yeast can only survive so much of its own alcohol before it dies off, which caps most beers and wines at a fairly modest strength. But somewhere in the ancient and medieval world, thinkers began chasing a way past that limit, and the tool they found would change everything: distillation. The idea is simple in principle. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water, so if you gently heat a fermented liquid, the alcohol rises first as vapor. Capture that vapor, cool it back into a liquid, and you are left with something far stronger and purer than anything yeast alone can make. The technique was refined over centuries, and much of the crucial early work was done by scholars in the medieval Islamic world, brilliant alchemists searching for the hidden essence of things. In fact, the very word alcohol comes from Arabic, from a term for a fine, refined powder, which over time came to mean the pure spirit drawn out of wine. Those scholars often pursued distillation for medicine and perfume rather than for drinking, but the knowledge spread. In Europe, the distilled result was given a name that reveals exactly how people saw it. They called it the water of life. It was thought to preserve health, warm the blood, and even hold off death. Much of that early European brewing and distilling knowledge was kept alive inside monasteries. Monks, with their patience, their record-keeping, and their long, quiet years, became master brewers and distillers, refining recipes for beer and for the powerful new spirits that would eventually become brandy, whiskey, and countless liqueurs. What had once been a soft, mild feature of daily life was becoming something concentrated and formidable. A drink you could once nurse all afternoon now came in a form that could knock a grown man flat with a few small cups. Each region bent this new power to its own harvest. In the cold north, distillers turned grain and potatoes into vodka, a spirit clear as water and strong enough to survive a brutal winter. In the hills of Ireland and Scotland, malted barley became whiskey, aged slowly in wooden casks until it turned gold. In France, wine itself was distilled down into brandy. Everywhere the still traveled, people found something local to pour into it, and the map of the world's most famous drinks began to take shape. And then that concentrated power went global, and its story turned dark. Distilled spirits were strong, they lasted a long time without spoiling, and they packed enormous value into a small barrel, which made them perfect for long voyages and long-distance trade. As European ships crossed the oceans, spirits traveled with them, and they became tangled in some of the ugliest chapters of the age. Rum, distilled from sugarcane grown on plantations, became a currency in the brutal Atlantic trade in enslaved people. Elsewhere, powerful liquor was handed to native peoples who had no long history with it and no cultural defenses against it, and it was used coldly and deliberately as a tool of exploitation. The same accident that had once helped feed our ancestors was now being used to break whole communities apart. By the 1700s, the sheer power of cheap distilled spirits collided with the crowded misery of a rapidly growing city, and the result was a catastrophe that gave the world one of its first great warnings about alcohol. The city was London, the drink was gin. Cheap grain and loosened laws meant that gin could be produced almost anywhere and sold almost everywhere. And in the poorest, most desperate districts of the city, it flooded in like water. This period became known as the Gin Craze, and for a time it tore through London society. Gin was strong, it was astonishingly cheap, and for people crushed by poverty and grinding labor, it offered a fast, brutal escape. Shops selling it multiplied on every street. Contemporary observers described scenes of collapse, of neglected children, of workers drinking away everything they had, of a city seemingly drowning in liquor. One famous engraving of the era, called Gin Lane, showed this nightmare in vivid detail, a world of ruin and despair with gin at its center. Alarmed authorities passed a series of laws trying to tax and control the trade, and it took years of struggle, several failed attempts, and slow economic change before the crisis finally eased. The lesson was hard and clear. A drink that had helped build civilization could also, in concentrated form and in the wrong conditions, help tear it apart. That fear did not fade. Across the 17 and 1800s, movements rose up in Europe and especially in the United States, arguing that alcohol was the root of poverty, violence, and moral decay, and that the only true solution was to remove it entirely. These were the temperance movements, and in America, they grew into a political force powerful enough to change the Constitution itself. In 1920, the United States did something extraordinary. It banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic drinks across the entire nation. This was Prohibition. On paper, it was a bold experiment in building a healthier, more sober society. In practice, it became one of the most famous failures in modern history. People did not stop wanting to drink, they simply started drinking illegally. Secret bars known as speakeasies opened by the thousands. Alcohol was smuggled across borders and brewed in hidden stills, and the enormous unmet demand handed a fortune to organized crime. Gangsters grew rich and powerful, running illegal liquor. Cities saw waves of corruption and violence, and the government watched its grand moral project curdle into chaos. After roughly 13 years, the United States admitted defeat and repealed Prohibition in 1933. The message was blunt. You could not simply legislate away a relationship that stretched back millions of years into our evolutionary past. Which brings us to now and to the strangest twist of all. After all of this history, all these empires and rituals and disasters, modern science has delivered a verdict that our ancestors never could have imagined. Alcohol, we now understand, is a genuine toxin. It is classified among the substances known to cause cancer. It damages the liver, the heart, and the brain. And health authorities increasingly state that there is no completely safe level of drinking. Around the world, alcohol is linked to millions of deaths each year through disease, through accidents, and through the slow harm it does inside the body. The drink that ancient peoples believed could hold off death is now understood in cold clinical terms to quietly hasten it. Doctors can point to the exact organs it wears down and the exact cells it damages. The water of life, it turns out, carries a real and measurable cost, one our ancestors had no way to see when they first raised a jar to their lips. And yet, knowing all of this, human beings have not walked away from it, and it is worth being honest about why. Alcohol is still poured at nearly every wedding, raised at nearly every celebration, and shared at nearly every farewell. It appears in the rituals of major religions, in the toasts that mark New Year's and new marriages, in the quiet drink shared between old friends who have not spoken in a while. For all its danger, it remains one of the most powerful social technologies our species has ever stumbled upon. A chemical shortcut to letting our guard down, to trusting strangers, to laughing a little more easily around a table. That is the real paradox at the heart of this story. The same accident that may have helped our ancestors survive, that may have coaxed us into farming, that fueled the workers of the first cities, that carried empires across the world, is also a poison that has ruined countless lives. Alcohol both built us up and burned us down, sometimes in the very same century, sometimes in the very same family. It is not simply good or bad. It is woven all the way through us, tangled into our biology, our history, and our deepest habits of gathering together. So the next time you see a glass of wine catch the light or hear the hiss of a bottle opening at a party, think back to that piece of fruit rotting on a forest floor 10 million years ago and the distant ancestor who followed the smell. That tiny accident set something in motion that would outlast every empire that ever tried to control it. A mistake made by invisible microbes helped turn wandering apes into farmers, builders, citizens, and kings. And it is still shaping how we live and how we suffer today. Not bad. For a substance nobody ever set out to invent. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of alcohol's strange history surprised you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can find it.